One of the most frequent questions that I get is how to use the mask in the panel. So today I want to talk about using luminosity masks as well as color masks to either blend multiple images in Photoshop or create targeted adjustments. All right, so let's start with the absolute basics. So what exactly is a mask? A mask, otherwise known as a layer mask, is going to be a tool that allows you to either show or hide certain parts of a layer or the entire layer. So let me create an adjustment layer for this example. I'm going to create a solid color layer and we'll just make this red. So by default, whenever you create an adjustment layer, it actually comes with a layer mask. So a standard layer mask is going to be white. So the rule is that white reveals and black conceals. So by default, you get a layer mask on an adjustment layer that shows the entire layer. Now, if we were to click invert, then you can see the mask is going to be black, and this is going to basically conceal the entire layer. So if we grab the brush, and I'm going to set my opacity and flow to 100. Now if I paint with white on this black layer mask, you can see that we're revealing the layer wherever we paint. In this case, the solid red color layer. Now on a standard layer mask, if we were to paint white, then nothing would happen, right? Because the entire layer mask is already white. But if we paint with black on the white layer mask, then you can see that we're actually hiding certain parts of the layer wherever we paint. So you can almost think of a layer mask as like a window that you're viewing the layer through. So when the layer mask is white, then you're able to see the entire layer. And when it's black, you're not able to see the layer at all. So what is a luminosity mask? So a luminosity mask is going to be a mask that's created from different brightness values in the image. So if we wanted to target the highlights, for example, we could create a highlights 1 mask, and you can see now that whatever is white is the highlights, and then whatever is black is the opposite, which would be the shadows, and everything in between is like gray. So white reveals and black conceals. So basically, if we created a mask with this highlights mask, then anywhere that's white would be revealed on the layer, and anywhere that's black would be hidden. Now, anything that's gray is basically going to be revealed at a lower opacity, somewhere in between white and black. So we can always refine these masks too by clicking refine, and we can play around with these basically to include or exclude less or more. We can also just create different luminosity masks that are more targeted. So you can see here we are more targeting only the brighter highlights, and then again the further we go down, it's just only targeting the brightest highlights. Same thing goes for shadows. Shadows 1 is going to be a very broad selection of all the shadows, revealing all the shadows in the image. And then as we go further down, it's going to be more targeted to just the darkest shadows. So what exactly is a color mask? So a color mask is going to create a layer mask basically based off of the color that you select or the color mask that you choose. So for example, if we choose a blue mask, it's going to select the blues in the image and create a layer mask that's going to reveal anything that is blue through that layer mask. So we could add that mask to an adjustment layer, for example, where we would only target the blues, basically because the blues are shown in white. Now there's a few different options for the color masks. We have basically the standard red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow. But you also have the shift feature for the RGB for Rgb Channel Mask. So if we hit shift, we can create a red channels mask. We can do a green channels mask or a blue channels mask. So these are just different selections basically created from the channels and a little bit more broader than the colors, but we can still use these for creating some very targeted adjustments or blends. We also have the ability to create a range mask, so you can actually just select a color within the image, and the fuzziness will allow you to either constrict the mask or expand it. And you can also hold down shift to add to the mask, or hold down option or alt on a PC to subtract from the mask. So I have the selection preview set to none, but you can do grayscale if you'd like. And then you can see the preview on the entire image, or just choose none just to see the preview in the little box. So let's talk about when we would use luminosity masks for blending multiple exposures. So I'm going to jump over here to Lightroom, but if you use Bridge, you can use Camera Raw basically and open up the images the same way as layers in Photoshop once you make your raw adjustments. All right, so why would we use luminosity masks to blend multiple exposures versus just doing HDR? So as you can see between these three exposures here, we have differences in the textures on the water. Also, there's some movements in the cloud as well. So if we were to blend this using HDR, we'd have very little control over what's included in the final result. So basically we would wind up with some overlap probably from the sky and the water. And we could try to deghost this, but we probably will not get the best results. And I'll show you in just a second why. Also, we don't have any control over basically what we include in the blend, right? So in a overexposed shot, for example, we would have very clean shadows. There's basically no noise in those shadows, but our highlights are going to be blown out. Now in the underexposed shot, we have the highlights completely intact, but the shadows are too dark. So we would increase the exposure on this and then bring down the highlights. And you see now that we have a ton of noise in the shadows. So basically using luminosity mask, we can specifically only blend back in the highlights, which are super clean, into an overexposed shot where the shadows are super clean. Basically getting the best of both frames and combining them into one. Versus if we were to do HDR, I'll show you guys right now. So in Lightroom, all you do is right click with the photo selected and then just do photo merge in HDR. So here you can already see that there is some overlap issues with the clouds, and I can tell that there's some issues in the water as well. And even if we use the deghost, I'll show you guys, I think this will actually get worse. Yeah, so now you can see with the deghost selected that we have more patches in the sky messed up and more patches in the water. And we'll go medium, and it's just progressively getting worse. So basically, if we want to create the best possible result with the blend, we would use luminosity mask. So just for kicks, I'm just going to do none, and I'm going to click merge, and I'm going to show you guys. All right, so clicking the final merge result here, let me just bump up the exposure really quick and bring down the highlights. And you can see if we're trying to expose this properly or bright enough, the highlights are still pretty blown out. So that's one con. And then also if we zoom in here, the shadows actually look pretty clean, but if I bump these up and I zoomed in, I can tell that there's still going to be a little bit more noisy than the overexposed shot, basically because the shadows were properly exposed. All right, so zooming back in on the sky, you can see we have issues, and I'm going to show you in a minute in Photoshop how we can just basically only blend in the highlights, or we can blend back in this area as well and just use the transform tool to just warp it over. Now that you're aware why we would use luminosity masks for manual blending over an HDR image, I'm going to show you guys how I would prep the images and then bring them into Photoshop and do an actual blend. So let me reset all the parameters here. All right, so our overexposed shot is going to have the cleanest shadows. So we're going to use this as our base image, and we're just going to blend the highlights back in from the underexposed shot. So I'm actually going to brighten this up even more. I'm going to open up the shadows a little bit, and I'm going to bring the highlights down. All right, so the goal when I'm blending multiple images together is to have all the images look similar. And the reason for this is because when we go to blend in certain parts of an image, for example, we blend the highlights back in, the areas where the highlights and the shadows meet are going to be very noticeable if we didn't make any adjustments to the underexposed shot. For example, there might be some fringing along the edges of these buildings. So what we would do is we would actually adjust the images basically to look similar to each other. So again, I just brought down the highlights a little in this one, opened up the shadows a little, and the base exposure, or the medium exposure, I would brighten this as well and bring down the highlights and open up the shadows. Now I probably won't use this base exposure, but sometimes it does help to bridge the gap between the two exposures. All right, and for the underexposed shot, I'm going to brighten this up a lot, bring down the highlights, and open up the shadows. And then this one, maybe even open up the blacks a little bit. And again, there's going to be a ton of noise here in the shadows, but not to worry because the highlights are super clean And basically we're only going to be using the highlights from this shot. So now if I toggle between these three shots, you can see that they're similar in brightness. One thing to note also is if you're using the profile corrections, you want to make sure that they're all checked and all the same settings for the images that you blend. For example, if you had the profile corrections and it was correcting for distortion in one image, but you didn't have that checked in the other, when you go to line those up and blend in Photoshop, they're not going to line up perfectly. All right, so I'm going to select all three out of this set by holding down Shift and then clicking on the third one. And then all I'm going to do is going to right click and then go to Edit In and then Open as Layers in Photoshop. So now we have all the layers in Photoshop. So you can see we have our overexposed layer on the top, then we have our base exposure in the middle, and our underexposure at the bottom. And you can again see that they're similar in values and brightness. So the shadows are a little brighter in the base exposure, but I'm going to brighten those up in a minute. All right, so basically whenever we're creating a luminosity mask, it is assessing the whole image of whatever is visible. So we want to make sure that whatever we want to create the luminosity mask from is visible when we actually create these. So in this case, I want to target these highlights in the blown out areas and the overexposed shot. So I'm going to make sure that this layer is visible when I create the mask. So first I'm going to start with highlights 1. And this is pretty broad. Generally, I will go a little bit broader than I need when I'm creating a mask, but this is still just a little too broad. So I'm going to try highlights 2. And I think this looks a little bit better here. So you can see it's a little more constricted. So again, whatever is in black is going to be concealed. Whatever is in white will be revealed. And whatever is basically in between in gray is going to be partially revealed based off of how bright it is. So the areas I'm trying to target are these bright highlights here. So this will work just perfectly. Now we could either apply this mask directly onto the layer that we're trying to reveal, basically the highlights in the underexposed shot, or we can create a group in a mask with this luminosity mask. And this is what I actually prefer and why I added this feature into the panel, because when you create a group in a mask, it's going to have multiple benefits. So let me go through a few of those. So once we have our group in mask, basically this is a group or a folder with the luminosity mask attached to it. We can take our underexposed shot, which is on the bottom, and then just drag that right into the group. And now you can see that basically the underexposed shot's only being revealed through this layer mask or this luminosity mask we created. And also, by the way, guys, if you need to refine the mask, you can always do so by showing the mask or selecting it and then clicking refine. And you can use the levels adjustment basically to make things more or less included. Again, black conceals, white reveals. So here we can make some parts of the image more black, and it's going to basically conceal those from the group and conceal those from the layer that we're showing. So in this case, I'm just going to conceal more of the shadows and midtones and just target the highlights just a little bit more. All right, so one of the reasons that I like to add the layer that I'm blending into the group is so that I can make some adjustments to it. So in this case, you can see that this doesn't line up perfectly because there was some movement in the clouds between the shots. So this is something that I would refine on the actual layer, and we can do so by selecting the actual layer and then making a selection with the marquee tool just in the area we want to transform. And then we can just click the transform button on the panel, right click, select warp, and now we can basically just warp this alignment back in place. Now the reason I made a selection like that is so that I'm not affecting the rest of the image. You know, I don't want to affect the buildings, for example, or trees or anything else that's in the image. So if I pan through, I think that looks good. I can click enter. And I do see one spot over here as well that looks a little funny. So I'm just gonna, again, click transform, right click and warp. And we can basically just warp this to line up through the mask. All right, I think that looks pretty good. So again, we're only revealing the underexposed shot through the area that we targeted through the luminosity mask. So another one of the reasons why I like to add the layer that I'm blending into the group is because if I want to, I can create an inverted layer mask on that layer and then only paint in the areas that I want to blend. So basically, I'm only revealing this image through the layer mask that is on the group. But if I want even more control, I can add this layer mask again onto this layer inside the group and then only paint in the areas that I want. So I'll show you why we possibly would want to do that. So to create an inverted layer mask, again, you're going to hold down Shift and then click on the mask button. Now this layer mask is all black. Again, black conceals, white reveals. So you can see that it's actually concealing the whole underexposed layer. Now if I select that layer mask and I paint with white on the black mask, you can see that we can paint back in just a portion of that image that we're blending back in. Now you can see that we haven't painted the highlights back in on the water, so we could choose to exclude those. So this would be a scenario where we would just want to be very selective and just paint in those highlights in the sky. And we also didn't paint back in the sky here where it didn't line up. So if you just wanted to leave that out altogether, you could do so. Or we could paint it back in, but I'm just actually going to leave this out for this example. And if I paint back in the highlights on the water, you can see we basically don't have any bright highlights. So you can be selective if you want to have brighter highlights in the image and just have it have a little more dynamic range. So in this case, I'm going to leave them brighter just by choice for aesthetic because they're not blown out, and I think it looks better than it trying to blend back in the highlights. All right, and then the third reason that I like to add the layer I'm blending into the group is because you can add multiple adjustments into that group, and then it's only basically revealed through the layer mask or the luminosity mask attached to the group. So if I add a curves layer, for example, you can see that we will only affect the highlights that we created that luminosity mask for because that adjustment is in the group. So I could, add a little more contrast in the highlights, or I could add some color adjustments in the highlights as well. I can make the brightest highlights a little more red, and you can see that it's only affected through this layer mask that's on the group. That's the only area that adjustment will be shown. Or let's say I want to add an effect like darken highlights. So in this case, we're only darkening the highlights through this layer mask instead of in the entire image. All right, so that's a little too strong. I'm going to leave that off. But those are just some examples why I like to use a group versus just adding the actual luminosity mask onto the layer I'm blending. So let me actually select our base layer and then make a targeted adjustment for these shadows here. So I'm going to select shadows 4. And again, I'm going to apply this as a group in a mask and then add a curves layer. So now whatever I adjust with this curves is only going to be affecting shadows targeted by that luminosity mask. So again, this is the cool thing about the group. So I can brighten the shadows, and you can see that it's brightening all the shadows that are selected through this luminosity mask here. But what I can do is I can only affect a specific area by clicking on the luminosity mask, inverting it, which basically hides the adjustment, and then I can grab my brush and just paint with white the areas that I want. So I can just brighten up those trees, for example, and maybe this area here. So another way you can do this, actually, I'm going to undo this, is you can grab your gradient tool and have this set for foreground to transparent. That's going to be under basics. That's going to be the middle one here, and then click OK. And if you just select this the second option here, you can just draw and start painting back in your adjustment in just specific areas, and it's going to be a little more feathered than if you were using a brush. It's going to look a little more natural. So I think I was just doing this at 40%, but you can do this, at a lower opacity and just basically keep stacking it on top of each other until you get the effect that you'd like. And you could also do this down here as well if you want. But it's just going to be a little more subtle than if you just grab the brush and start brushing. All right, so that's how we would use Luminosity Mask for blending and then targeted adjustments. And then once I'm happy with how everything is looking all together, then I would go to the very top and then click Stamp Up. And then you can start editing this image as if it's one photo. So usually I would bring this into Camera Raw, and then I would start doing adjustments here. And now we have a blended image that's all on one layer. All right, so let's say we want to use color mask to make some targeted adjustments. So color masks aren't going to typically be used for blending, but they are really good for making specific adjustments to certain colors, whether that's, modifying the color or removing the color altogether. So for example, if I want to change the colors or modify the colors in the cloud, I can select these clouds here. And to help, you can also just have none selected, and that'll give you a little bit better idea of what you're working with here. So again, we can adjust the fuzziness, and like I said, broader is better, for the feathering, basically, to make it less noticeable, or the transition. So I'm going to go with a little bit broader, selecting most of the sky. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to select group and mask. Again, this is my favorite. You can apply these directly to an adjustment, but again, using group and mask, you can add multiple adjustments into the group, and that's going to allow you to make multiple adjustments shown through that mask we created. So in this case, I'm going to go to Effects. Let's go to Color Balance, and I can change the midtones basically. And now you can see that we're adjusting the tones just in that area that we targeted through the color mask. So now I can make the orange appear a little bit more red. And this also doesn't just work with color. We could also add a curves layer, for example, and then target the brightness in just that area in the color. So maybe I'll add a photo filter. By default, it's a warming filter. Or if the sky was too warm, you could do Shift, click, and then add a cooling filter. Or you could add a specific filter like Lux or Vivid. So let's add Vivid. And you can see that that actually increases the contrast and the color targeted specifically through this color mask. So if I turn that off and on, you can see basically we just made the sky pop a little bit more. And if we think that the effects that we added are too strong, you could turn those down individually, or the benefit of the group as well is you can just select the group and you can turn down the opacity of all the adjustment layers at once. So let's make it a little more subtle, for example. And here you can see there's a little bit more of a subtle effect. So again, whenever you're creating color masks, it's best to create these from an actual pixel layer. So if I want to create more color masks, for example, I could close this group and then reselect my actual layer that has the pixels on it, and then create more color masks from that. If you try to do this from an adjustment layer or a group, for example, it's not going to be able to actually select the colored pixels. So another cool thing you can do is you can dodge and burn specifically targeted areas based off of the brightness or the color. So for example, if I wanted to brighten up these trees, I could make a yellow mask. This is going to actually be more yellow than green in this scenario. And then I could click Refine. And basically the goal would be to get the trees to be pretty bright here. And I could click OK. And I can actually just add this directly as a dodge and burn. So dodge and burn soft light will be more subtle. Dodge and burn overlay is going to be more harsh. So let's go with the dodge and burn overlay. And then I'll just grab my brush, so hit B on the keyboard, and I'll hit D for default colors. And then I'll hit X to toggle between the foreground and the background color. And with white selected, let me actually adjust the opacity. Let's go down to like 20%. You can actually use the keys on the keyboard as well. So if you hit 2, that's going to be for 20% opacity. And if you hit Shift 2, that would be for 20% flow. Now, I can start to paint white on these trees here. And basically, I'm just brightening or dodging by painting. Now if I turn that off and on, you can see it's just a subtle effect, but you get the idea. Or alternatively, if we wanted to make a shadows selection again, so the shadows luminosity mask, we could do the same thing, add that as a dodge and burn layer. and we could dodge on the shadows. Yeah, actually, let me turn this up. So I'm going to do 80% opacity. You can see that we can just dodge just on the shadows and it's not going to affect anything else. If I turn that off and on, you can see I was just painting or dodging directly onto the image, and it's only going to affect those shadows. So these are some ways that we can use the Luminosity Mask and Color Mask for blending and targeted adjustments. These are pretty much just the basics, but I will be releasing a mask masterclass soon if you want to get a deep dive into masking and blending and also editing with the panel. So be on the lookout for that. I hope that you guys found this video helpful and that it cleared up any confusion surrounding masks. But if you have any questions still, you can drop them in a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible.